Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's episode of Teneo Insights. It's Wednesday, July 29th, and I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. On February 28th, 151 days ago, the U.S. and Israeli war with Iran started. 42 days ago, on June 17th, the so-called Memorandum of Understanding was signed, and a brief period of relative quiet, increased traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, and lower oil prices ensued, only for hostilities to restart recently, albeit at a more restrained rate than during the pre-ceasefire period. And now the conflict threatens again to expand, with the Houthis threatening traffic in the Red Sea, Ukraine striking an Iranian ship in the Caspian Sea. There are reports of deliveries from China to Iran of Manpad anti-aircraft weaponry, and Saudi Arabia just yesterday acknowledging direct involvement for the first time as it joined the U.S. in striking Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. Today, we'll discuss the state of the war and where we might go from here, where we'll consider the situation through the lens of the military and energy markets. And to do so, I'm joined by two colleagues. General Frank McKenzie is a principal with our sister firm, West Exec Advisors. His 42-year career in the U.S. Marine Corps culminated with his command of U.S. Central Command, or CENTCOM, the command with responsibility for the Middle East region from 2019 to 2022. Earlier this year, General McKenzie was appointed the 21st president of the Citadel, the military college in South Carolina. That's his alma mater. I'm thrilled to have him on Insights for the first time. We're also joined by someone familiar to all of you. Emily Stromquist is a Teneo Managing Director. She's a leader of the political risk business, as well as leading our Middle East and energy-related research. So, General and Emily, thank you both for joining us today. And General, maybe I can start with you. I mean, it would appear that we are in something of a stalemate right now in terms of we're not in total kinetic war. We're also certainly not in any kind of a situation of a durable peace. Neither side seems like it can really neutralize the other's advantages or really compel terms one way or the other. And President Trump appears to have been given some advice by military advisors of late that an additional doubling down of the air war alone was probably not going to result in a changed outcome in the theater. So perhaps you can start us off here by just giving us your assessment through that military lens of where things stand and kind of the sit rep.
Sure, and delighted to be with you, Kevin, as always. We're at a pause right now. I think we struck a lot of targets in Iran. They struck some targets themselves across the Gulf states and with our bases across the region. We have the ability to escalate significantly. Iran's ability to escalate while there is considerably more limited. So the decision to go to a higher order war here is one of choice for the United States. For the Iranians, it's a little more limited, and we should just know that. The Iranian objective in this war is pretty narrow. They want to survive. They want to survive with their theocratic leadership intact, and we have seen them go to great lengths in the past to make concessions in order to achieve that. Our goals are more expansive. Broadly, I think it's opening the Strait of Hormuz, something on their nuclear program, something on their ballistic missile program, something on their proxies. And what those somethings are, we can discuss their ranges of outcomes there. But I think those are really what the United States is seeking here. So we're at a pause. I think we're pending a decision by the president to go forward. Or, the Iranians, when I was the CENTCOM commander, Kevin, I used to say, anytime I was arguing for forces, I could always count on them to bail me out. And I think an example of that would be the attack on our forces in Jordan just here over the last few hours, which is not necessarily something that, if you're an Iranian strategist, not necessarily something that's in your best interests. You want to keep the United States in negotiations. You want to keep this war at the bubbling level rather than have it escalate. Because again, I know all the escalation options are ours. Very few of those belong to Iran.
So when you think about this sort of narrowly through the lens of a lot of economic actors and corporations in particular, their key focus is on the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, both because of their direct exposure to cargo that needs to transit in or out of the Persian Gulf, or the indirect economic costs of it. And so I wonder, clearly, as CENTCOM commander and throughout the military leadership, the planning for the Strait of Hormuz being closed and what to do about it has been something that's been scenarioed and war gamed out for a very long time. So I guess, can you explain for our audience to a certain degree, given the status right now where the traditional pathway is basically shut because of mining, and there's this southern Omani route and the northern Iranian route that have had limited openings over the ceasefire period. What would it take to reopen the strait in as full of a way as that term would imply, and to keep it open?
Kevin, first of all, let me be clear. I don't have access to classified information, so I'm reading, what's been published out there. I think the real threat in the Strait, the mines are certainly a threat. I think the drone threat is a new element. And I think we're still adjusting to that. Drones are threats to warships, but warships can generally defend themselves against those. A tanker is unable to do that. And as you know, while it might not sink a warship, it could still have while it can't sink a tanker, it can still have significant effect on the tanker. And that's enough maybe to, for insurance companies to not want to insure those vessels coming through. And I think we need to recognize that. So what we would need to do in order to reopen the straits here is actually what you need to, I'm sorry, yeah. Let me pause there. I dropped you for a second. I'll go back. What we need to do in order to consider reopening the Strait would be an aggressive program of removing Iranian launching sites across the northern edge of the littoral that abuts the Strait of Hormuz. I believe CENTCOM has been pursuing that program to some degree, just based on what I see about their targeting. You got to go after those. You've got to remove the Iranian ability to strike ships in the straits. Then you've got to remove their ability to mine out there. The Iranians mine without regard to where those mines go or anything else. I think we've had some success reducing their stockpiles of mines. You need to make sure they can't do any more mining. And then once it's okay for your mine countermeasures vessels to operate in the strait, you can clear the mines from designated passage areas, as you've noted. The one down south near Oman, we probably have others in mind that we aren't being public about. So all those things are certainly possible. And here's a key point that I think is sometimes lost. It is not necessary to occupy any part of Iran in order to do this work. You need to control it by fire. You do not need to put forces on the ground. Now, I have argued that thinking about seizing Kharg Island is something we should consider, and I still think that's something we should consider. That's not part of opening a Strait of Hormuz. As you know, Kharg Island is several hundred miles
Right.
inside the Strait of Hormuz, and I would like to talk about it because I think it's a valid military objective. It's just not part of opening the Strait of Hormuz. So what you've got to do here is you've got to establish a condition where Iran can't interfere with what's going on in the Strait by drones, by cruise missiles. Then you worry about what you can do with the mine warfare in the mine warfare domain. Look, the United States Navy, and it's not just the Navy that would do this, it's the United States Navy, the United States Air Force, and other elements of the Joint Force. We have the ability to do this. Admiral Cooper can do it. It won't be an overnight thing. And we can do it under one of two conditions. We can do it under the conditions where the Iranians back off and let us do it, clean up the wreckage that's there, or we can do it in a condition where they actively oppose us. Obviously, the second condition will be a significant combat operation. It is within our capability to do that. The United States Navy does not like to operate in narrow waters. They've never liked to be in narrow waters. And having been the CENTCOM commander, I know and understand why they don't like to be up there. But the fact of the matter is, they're very good at it, and they can do it if necessary. And I'll pause there, Kevin.
Yeah, so maybe we could bring Emily into the conversation here as well, because you bring up an interesting point about the opening of the strait. That, there's a lot of different definitions of open, right? So, there's physically open, like you could get cargo through. Then there's openness to the point where coverage can be provided by insurers at a given rate. And then there's open of actually crews and ship owners will allow their cargoes to even transit, irrespective of whether they can get cover or not. So, when you were at CENTCOM and spoke with global shipping companies and the like, I mean, where's the tipping point on where you would, not to say we would get back
Yeah,
to pre-war
yeah,
150 ships a day going
right,
through the
right.
Strait, but what's necessary?
So I think you got to show it to them. You got to prove it to them. As you know, the insurers, they're a hard-eyed bunch of people. They're going to look at it. They're going to want for a proof of concept. So you can do it by escorting, which we've done, and the U.S. Navy has a long history of escorting through there. That's probably the lowest standard. What you really want, as you noted, is you really want free passage, so ships can go through without concern of Iranian attack. That's a very high standard. It's going to take us a while to get to that if that's the standard we want to pursue. I would think a convoy standard is probably obtainable as a going in position, and then over time you work up to where you've taken down so much Iranian capability that they actually can't interfere with you at all. And I am under no illusion about what a large operation that would be and how significantly draining of resources it would be, not only to execute it and achieve the initial standard, but also to maintain it over time. And you would actually look over time for other nations that have a vested interest in that oil and other material going through the straits to participate in those operations.
And just to clarify, if President Trump made the decision that we were going to open the strait in the way that you have just defined it, is that something that could start tonight, or would we as observers would we visibly see a buildup of additional capabilities in the region to know that was coming?
Great question. I think it could start tonight. I think actually is part of CENTCOM's program over the last couple of weeks. I think they've been hitting some of those targets anyway. So I think it's sort of we've been prepping for that. I would guess that Admiral Cooper would probably want more resources, but I couldn't speak for him. But it could certainly start very quickly. It's not something that's going to be done in a day or two. It's going to take a little time because the Iranians had a lot of time now to observe what we do. They've had the opportunity to move stuff around. Uh, on the other hand, we now have functionally complete air superiority over the Strait of Hormuz and over the southern part of Iran. So we can put a persistent ISR coverage overhead so we can look all the time, the ubiquitous stare that we can see what they're doing. And those are relative, there's not a lot of threat to those platforms. And so that works to our advantage. But yeah, this is going to be a resource intensive thing. Admiral Cooper's probably going to want more. I have no read on what's in there right now, particularly, or what else would be needed.
And just to clarify for our audience, Admiral Cooper, that General McKenzie keeps referring to, is the current head of CENTCOM in the region. But Emily, everything that General McKenzie has just described about what is possible and what is doable is clearly not the situation there right now. You talk to a lot in industry and in the insurance industry, for that matter, as well. So clearly, the proof of concept is not there yet in terms of the openness of the strait.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, there were two significant underlying issues that General McKenzie already referenced. It's the nuclear program, and now it's become reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And I think there's the military aspect of that, and there's the diplomatic aspect of that. The diplomatic aspect has proven difficult time and time again to get to a point where we can start to converge on what are acceptable terms between the U.S. and Iran. In particular, this is the best leverage that Iran has in negotiations right now. It's seen that it takes very little to accomplish quite a lot. The fear alone has sustained this, and so it's not a card that they're going to give up very easily. So I think there was some suggestion of momentum this week when Oman had raised this idea of a potential plan. This was a joint management of Strait of Hormuz with Iran. Gulf states had reportedly backed that. The plan was kind of akin to the Strait of Malacca plan, whereby Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore all asked for voluntary contributions to ensure safe passage, and that's largely around things like buoys and lighthouses. We're not talking actual physical risk to vessels passing through from strikes, obviously. So a bit of a different situation, but ultimately Iran has turned that down. I think any of these options that look at joint management are very difficult. First, because we're talking about in many of these cases voluntary fees. Voluntary fees are very difficult for legal reasons, for the implications that are attached to these. Any kind of voluntary fee, in by default, you're basically paying a sanctioned organization, now the IRGC, by paying some kind of a fee, right? Even if voluntary. The other issue is that in theory, that could go against the UN Law of the Sea. The IMO hasn't participated in these discussions. So all of these details are very difficult and nuanced to iron out. So this isn't a straightforward solution at all. Iran is meanwhile saying that it wants the entire inbound route plus charging for optional services and not, this isn't just about paying to transit. So I think this is all going to be a very difficult negotiation. I don't see this kind of progressing on the diplomatic side very quickly. I think there's a good reason to assume that what we're seeing from Iran right now is maximalist, to try to use this for ongoing leverage. They're not going to put all their cards on the table at the moment. But what they're going to need to get to move at all on that is sort of other trade-offs, and that could be things like economic concessions. They had been negotiating during the period of the MOU about getting half of the assets that are currently frozen. So I think there's going to be some give and take. I don't know that that's the path forward, but I think that's what the Iranians are looking for: is here are our maximalist terms. What are you going to do for us so we can find something that works?
And just to be clear, when you're referring to the voluntary fees, that's the so-called Strait of Malacca model, which is obviously a very, very different situation that only demonstrates how challenging this one is. General, I want to get back to your Kharg Island point here in just a moment, but just to go back to what I said at the very outset when I was introducing the call, that there had been news reports out there that military leadership had sort of admonished the president that that kind of doing more of the same was not going to yield us a different outcome. Number one, put troops and materiel at risk and further deplete some of these high cost munitions, both offensive and defensive capabilities, assuming the Iranians were going to shoot back, which they have been doing. And I guess my question for you is, do you agree with that assessment? And the follow-up is, we've seen a lot of news stories with regards to the depletion of these weapons, particularly the Patriots, also because of the war in Ukraine, and obviously concerns of being able to defend our interests in the Asia Pacific as well. Is that story overdone, or is that a real live concern that we should have?
So let me answer that indirectly, Kevin. Go back to a point I made earlier. Iran responds to direct pressure. Iran responds most strongly when it's existential pressure. So if you want to do business with the Iranians, if you want to negotiate with the Iranians, you really have to do it with your boot on their neck. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere with these negotiations. They'll be pleased to draw them out over time, arguing about the size of the table, the size of the font, and the announcements, as you know, everything except central and core issues. And they're brilliant at doing this. So yeah. I would argue that we need to apply direct pressure. The Kharg Island one is probably the best example of that. That's a piece of ground that really is the choke point for Iranian exportation of oil. We don't want to destroy it because that would have a permanent effect, not a permanent effect, but a long-term effect on the global economy. But the idea of seizing it means that it can be returned. It also means that now you hold ground, Iranian soil, which I think would be particularly humiliating and bothersome to them. So that's why I and we have always worked for many years, the Kharg Island operation. I think it's why the president is considering it. I have no idea if he's going to choose to go there. But I think if you want to put pressure on them, there's a way to put pressure on them. Now, look, I don't minimize the risk of going up to Kharg Island. It's well inside the Arabian Gulf. It's a long steam up there. You're going to be close to Iran with forces on the ground, but not on the ground inside Iran, on an island. It's the one island worth seizing. There are a lot of islands down there around the Gulf that I've talked about that we can control by fire. Kashem, Greater Tooms, Lesser Tooms, the other islands down there, you can control those by fire. Holding Kharg is not related to that. What it is related to doing is placing a insuperable blow, really, against Iran that would cause them, I think, to consider negotiating to get it back. Look, it's an option. Again, the president's considering it. I have no idea if he's going to choose to do it. I know that it places us at risk going up there, but I think that's manageable risk, and we've got a Navy that can do it, and we've got forces that can seize that island and hold it. The other alternative is you continue to apply greater degrees of pressure against those mechanisms that allow the Iranian regime to govern effectively. IRGC headquarters, leadership positions, things like that. Those are targets that we could consider striking or restriking if we wanted to raise the ante. So there's plenty of ground to go up here. As to the actual discussions about what we've got left in terms of munitions, I'm just not in a position to know. I know that Admiral Cooper, the CENTCOM commander, and other commanders worry about that extensively. That's a question that would have to be juggled at the very highest level. But I do know this: you're probably not going to get anywhere with Iran by appearing to back down. And I know that they're concerned about President Trump and his willingness to escalate. And I think that's a powerful advantage that we have. And I think many of his instincts have been right in this conflict to date. And I think they're very concerned about what decision he could make here. And we ought to preserve that concern and not give it away without some benefit to ourselves.
Right. Yeah. I think the president did tip his hand a little bit earlier in the week when we sort of suggested he wished he had more of these weapons. But I guess on the Kharg Island question, again, in terms of what is achieved by seizing it, to your point, that one of the criticisms the president has come under, obviously, is a lack of clear articulation to the electorate about what the objectives are, what the price that's going to be paid to achieve it is, and so on and so forth. And we've just seen over the last week or so, when we had a number of unfortunate and tragic fatalities amongst our forces in the region, and how the Pentagon has been accounting for that in public, et cetera. If we were to do a Kharg Island, is there going to be a requirement of preparing the electorate for something that could be not just achievable in your point, but there could be a price to pay?
Absolutely. But I'll tell you this, Kevin, we're 150 days into this
Yeah.
conflict. If you had told me at plus 150 in a major conflict with Iran, we would have lost a couple of aircraft to enemy fire, a handful of others on the ground, and the casualties are what they are. I would have rejected that data as being far too rosy because
Mm,
that's not what the simulations told me. And I've
yeah.
run a lot of simulations about what a war with Iran would look like. So,
Right.
yes, we should recognize that if we go up to Kharg Island, there's possibility of casualties occurring. I think the president recognizes that, which is, I think, rightly why he's considering it very judiciously as he takes a look at it. Uh, and that certainly is a possibility. And that's his task to explain why we need to do it. I think the Kharg Island argument is it really gives us a bargaining chip to use against Iran in a way that achieves economic effect as well as political effect internal to Iran that they will not be able to refute, and that we now hold a chunk of Iranian soil. And I think we overlook the importance of that to the psyche of Iranian leadership. They will understand and know what we're doing if we do that. We have no interest in holding that forever. We want to trade it for something valuable. Something valuable might be one of the conditions we talked about earlier: passage of the Strait of Hormuz, something on the nuclear program, something like that. That's a way to get to that point.
Emily, to that point, what's your sense of our sense, the American sense of let's call it the power map inside Iran right now, after the disruptions caused by, the early killing of Ayatollah Khamenei, the ascendancy, but essential invisibility of his son and successor Mujtaba, the IRGC, what the power dynamic is. Do you feel like we've got a good sense of it, and that we're negotiating with those who are actually empowered to negotiate and to follow through on anything that they agree to?
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak for the American view on that. I think the sense is that it's certainly odd that we haven't seen any sort of public appearances or references to Khamenei, to the son. I think that suggests a lot about how current leadership is running in the country. Obviously, there's the hardliners, and then there's those who are trying to take a more moderate position, but have not been sort of particularly effective to date doing so. Certainly there was a sense that Khamenei's son was far less cautious on things like the nuclear program and a more kind of hawkish approach to the conflict with the U.S. And that there was far more at stake in that being the counterparty. So certainly everything speaks to fragmentation, far less coordination. Leadership of the IRGC was obviously heavily targeted. You're dealing with sort of new faces, less experienced leaders within the IRGC. So that's created, a lot more disjointedness in negotiating tactics and in sort of what's actually being negotiated for. So I think that's making it exceedingly difficult as well. It's certainly a contributing factor to not being able to advance talks at the moment, but I wouldn't put most of the weight about where we're at right now and why on that particular factor.
General, when I teed up the call, I had spoken about concerns about, the widening of the war or even internationalization of it, what with the Houthis, other GCC states getting directly involved, obviously Israel, but even, the Ukraine situation in the Caspian and Chinese supply of weaponry and so on, the Russians. How big of a concern is this to you, and does that create then kind of a lot of risk that things could go in unintended or unanticipated ways, or you think it's more contained than that suggests?
Oh, Kevin, I've said from the beginning that Iran's decision to widen the war, and it was their decision to widen the war by striking civilian targets across the Gulf states, was a strategic mistake of the first order. In fact, I think you put it up there on a level, compare it to Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor. It was an unforced error. He did not have to do that. What he allowed then was Roosevelt to bring the nation into a global war rather than being focused on Japan. I think what effectively Iran has done by opening the aperture, attacking these other countries, is to move them off a chilly and even negative neutrality to where the aircraft are flying are striking targets yesterday, and and UAE, I guess, has struck targets in at least on the islands around Iran. So Iran has done something they did not need to do, which was produce a collective, more or less, approach to them across the region, which I would think would not be a goal of Iranian foreign policy. You would not prefer to have that happen. So I think this has been a significant mistake. Now, I understand their logic. The logic behind the Iranian attack was to try to force these nations to pressure the United States to cease and desist. That is not obtained. And what you see now are nations arming and striking Iran directly. That can't be where they want to be in this conflict in any way. So that's one point. Look, I take your point about Chinese manpads, particularly possibly showing up there. Look, manpads in and of themselves are not going to be particularly dangerous to us because they're not high altitude weapons. We can operate above that level. I would think we would be very closely looking at more sophisticated air defense systems that would come in and be set up. You can't do those in the course of an afternoon. We're going to know because you got to tune them, you have to calibrate them, you have to test them. We're going to know if those things come in and are tested. We would then have the opportunity to remove them. And I'm sure our Israeli friends would probably choose to do that too, given a choice. So that's something I think we will know if there's significant armaments coming in from those other countries, and we'll have a chance to act on them, I think, before they become effective. Beyond that, it's hard to see how much more they could actually bring into Iran to contest us. I'm not tracking anything, particularly the Russians have done, aside from massive intelligence sharing, which I think is certainly not something that we're delighted to see, but something that nonetheless we can measure. The final point I'd make on this is, look, if it happens in Iran, we're going to have pretty good knowledge of it. The human intelligence penetration of Iran is pretty significant. We're going to know, and they're not going to be able to keep secrets from us about what they do with China, what they do with Russia, or what they do with the nuclear program for that matter. And I think that is significant, and probably is why we aren't seeing the new supreme leader, because they know that if he starts talking, we're going to be able to target him should we choose to do so. And the only way to keep him out of that line of fire is to protect him to such a degree that he's functionally useless as a leader.
It occurs to me that the other major strategic mistake they've made most recently is in the aftermath of the signing of the MOU. They should have stuck to the terms that advantaged them to a certain degree, and they should have allowed the traffic to continue, unimpeded through the Strait for the 60 days, and then started to bring the tolls in. They'd be that much closer to the midterm elections and to winter. So, we'll see. You brought up the nuclear program. The president has mused in recent days of striking what's sometimes known as Pickaxe Mountain, which it seems like the Iranians may have moved some of their remaining nuclear capabilities into after the strikes of last summer. But it also would seem, you've pointed out the Iranians are savvy negotiators. They know how to drag things out. They are also not dummies, and so they study what happens and adjust accordingly. Presumably, they got a pretty good sense of how deep our best conventional munitions can go during the strikes last summer. Did they just bury everything that much deeper?
Kevin, I got to be careful talking here. I would just tell you, it's not possible for them to go deep enough or to hide it in some way that we can't get to it. If we want to get to it, we're going to get to it through a variety of different ways. Those are options that are very much on the table. I think we have a good picture of what they're doing, but we have a lot of options that we could present to the president should he choose to do that. And the Iranians may not, but those options are there.
Just sticking with the nuclear for just a moment, and I know this is not necessarily directly related to today, but the deal that was announced last week with regards to a civilian nuclear program for Saudi Arabia. I think those who are paying attention have seen all of the risks associated with that have been mentioned, as well as now the delays around it, possibly by making it contingent on Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. But nonetheless, does an additional country getting even civilian nuclear programs? I would point out that most military nuclear programs started as civilian nuclear programs. So there's always that question: does it raise proliferation concerns? I guess let's put it that way. Just considering the neighborhood that this is occurring in.
Sure, it certainly raises concerns. You've got to look at what controls are going to be imposed upon it, what the nature of our agreement with them is going to be. I actually sort of like the idea of linking it to a recognition of Israel and moving forward on the Abraham Accords. It's a significant point of leverage, and I certainly appreciate the technique of doing that. Look, in general, proliferation is not a good thing. But we're probably past the point where we're going to be able to prevent proliferation. I think we're at a point now where we need to control proliferation, manage it as effectively as we can, and what's most in consonance with our interests.
And just to be clear, the civilian nuclear programs in Saudi Arabia tied to the Abraham Accords was on offer from President Biden, I believe, although it came with the guardrails more akin to the UAE's nuclear deal than what is at least being publicly reported on this one. But Emily, if I could bring you in now here for a moment, because as we look at the scenarios that General McKenzie has sort of painted from further attriting their capabilities, their military capabilities to prevent shipping in the Gulf or through the Strait, as well as up to including the Kharg Island scenario that you were talking about, are all the kinds of things that will trigger concerns in energy markets and oil traders and financial markets more broadly. And I'm wondering, obviously at the early stages of this war, we saw oil spike up to about $120 a barrel, which was high, but obviously not as high as some of the, say, upwards of $200 a barrel, risks and concerns that we're seeing out there. But I'm wondering if we have a new situation where the Strait is effectively closed, kinetic activity looks like it's picking up again, and there's people dying, et cetera, is the situation in the sort of the global oil, energy supply demand dynamic, et cetera, different this time around as we head into fall and winter? That traders are going to look at it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the big difference between sort of this $120 per barrel price environment that you're talking about at the start of the conflict versus where we're at now is that the market is largely no longer pricing in catastrophic supply disruption. Instead, there's this kind of just persistent risk premium. In March, traders were looking at a scenario where 15 to 20 million barrels per day could be unavailable and for an unknown period of time. Prices definitely reflected this uncertainty. I think supply on the one hand has proven far more resilient than fears had suggested. OPEC Plus's unwound production cuts, non-OPEC growth has been notable. The UAE has increased its production. Saudi Arabia has managed to preserve its spare capacity. Various SPRs and strategic reserves have helped to buffer those shocks throughout. Shipping is now more expensive, but it hasn't come to a standstill. And I think the other side of that is often less discussed is the demand side. Demand has also softened. There's slower industrial activity in parts of Asia. There's lower Chinese crude demand. There's higher electric vehicle penetration than there had been in recent years. There's efficiency gains, inventory drawdowns. All of that has helped support and balance the market. It's still precarious, yes. In the fall, the situation certainly changes if significant disruptions persist. Then we see heating demand rise. Refiners start to switch their product slates in favor of heating fuels. The competition for LNG intensifies as storage rebuilding happens. I think overall, seasonal demand increases are going to arrive at a time when buffers are lower. So I think, yes, certainly a serious disruption starts to add on to that price premium. I think what's interesting is that it leads to a very important question about what is that price premium. I'm not going to give any sort of magical solution here. I don't have an equation to tell you how that works. But I think early in the conflict, there was this assumption that, okay, there's kind of a geopolitical risk premium and there's kind of just a security risk premium. Both of those are probably about $20 per barrel, given how we've seen markets move. I think what's interesting now is that if there's, for instance, a dual choke point disruption or a more sustained and widespread disruption to shipping, all of a sudden that security risk premium because it becomes a much larger unknown number. So you see certain analysts saying this is the $150 per barrel environment. Others saying this could be 200 plus. Doesn't really matter except to say that that's going to be a much more significant number going into the fall if we see some of these multiple extensive disruptions happen.
So just to be clear, some of the dynamics that we're seeing out there. So for instance, that a lot of these strategic stockpiles have been drawn down considerably during the war. And so there's less of that cushion today than we had at the outset of the war. You've got now the Red Sea potential issue thanks to the Houthis. You've got, say, the Russians now importing processed fuels of all things. And China, perhaps their kind of relative demand restraint that we'd seen earlier is perhaps coming off. Does that all add up to anything, or is that not enough for you to change your thinking?
Yeah, it adds up to increased tightness at a time when there's already market tightness. It adds to that sort of premium and the concerns about how high prices can go if that's the $120 per barrel environment or more. I think the more factors you throw into the mix right now and the more sort of fusion of different disruptions and conflicts that we see happening, that creates sort of a much more difficult environment to be able to move things around with ease and be able to adjust the markets so that, supply is meeting demand in the appropriate places. So yes, I absolutely think that those things are all complicating the picture, and that's exactly what we'll be watching, going into the fall now.
Can we talk about one very specific element, though, and you alluded to it earlier, and that's on the LNG front, because obviously Europe's fuel storage, LNG storage is not filled as we head toward winter. The longer this goes on, the less time they've got to get there, and we are seeing that cargoes that are making it onto the water are increasingly being competed for. And Europe finding itself outbid by Asian buyers. And how real and how long lasting is the shutdown of a significant percentage of Qatar's exportability on LNG, and they don't have alternative routes to market for that, right? So how about on the LNG picture in particular?
I mean, I think you just painted it pretty well. I think those are the issues that we're up against. That, you have a number of Asian buyers who are able to compete at a very high price points with Europe. That'll pull some of those cargoes out of the European market, those spot cargoes. So I think, it's going to be, Europe also went into the summer months, which is its restock months at significantly lower levels than it had in recent years in storage. So there's a lot more work to be done in terms of rebuilding that storage ahead of the winter. I mean, not to sort of add too many factors into the mix, but you have also Ukraine in the midst of its sort of ongoing conflict with Russia, and Russia looking at targeting power infrastructure. So there's a lot of potential disruptors for the European market. Have the Europeans grown significantly more efficient? Yes. Is there a lot more available alternative fuels and clean fuels in the market now, clean energy in the market? Yes, absolutely. That all helps. There's been a significant push to diversify, sources of imports into the European market. So all of that is a positive. That doesn't mean it's not a costly winter for the Europeans, though, if it's a very cold one.
General, I want to kind of land the plane here by asking you a final couple of questions, if I may. You talked a bit about the amount of time spent by you and your colleagues and peers, your predecessors and successors at CENTCOM, for just this conflict, irrespective of what the political drivers of it, but the conflict with Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the like. When you think back on all of the work that you did on that front, and now that we've had it play out in reality, is there anything that Iran has done, or been able to do, or not done, that's really surprised you? And I wonder, I think back, Churchill, when he wrote his biography of the Duke of Wellington, he talked about, one of the things he talks about is how great battles have the ability to create a new environment and a new atmosphere that everybody kind of has to adjust to in a way, and that there was a psychological impact of Iran actually standing up to the United States here and surviving, and holding the global economy at bay with their control over the Strait. How would you respond to that?
Kevin, I would just note that it's not over yet, so Iran may not yet survive in a sense of victory or defeat in this conflict. But I take your point. Look, for me, I've been drones, and the use of drones, I think, is having a dramatic effect on warfare, and the hybrid application of drones, unmanned systems being used in conjunction with manned systems. We saw it in Ukraine. We saw it begin to be there. My last couple of years in CENTCOM, I used to say, and I've said publicly and in testimony, that I no longer had uncontested air superiority across the theater because of drones, small unmanned drones. That was true when I left active duty in 2022. It has become far more profound now. How that is digested is going to define warfare for the next 10 or 15 years. And I think we will eventually master this. We're digesting it now. And by unmanned systems, I mean airborne systems, systems that operate on the surface of the earth, on the surface of the water, and underwater. We're going to be in all those domains going forward. That is not a surprise, but just a recognition that is dramatically changing what's happening, certainly in the Strait of Hormuz, what's happening to our Gulf partners. It is not so much the Iranian ballistic missiles, which we have taken significant steps at preventing from being effective, so much as it is the drones. That's a thing, and we should just recognize warfare is an eternal interplay between offense and defense. And what we're seeing is that being carried out in real time right now. My belief is we're going to prevail at this. We're going to master it. We're going to be very good at it before it's over. We are still learning that right now.
And yeah, final question. I mean, I guess it seems to me that one of the lessons that we've learned, though, from both the Ukraine war and the Iran war, and certainly something that China should probably think about when they look at Taiwan, is that we tend to think of it as the biggest, most powerful countries kind of just dictate because they're big and powerful. But the smaller countries actually have quite a vote in how things play out, and that's not always anticipated by the leadership of the more powerful countries. But to your point about this evolution of warfare that you're talking about, I think it would be not. I don't think it would be controversial to say that our military and the civilian infrastructure behind it is extremely large. It's a giant operation in terms of money, in terms of weapons platforms, in terms of personnel, bases, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, it's like the cliche of trying to turn an oil tanker at sea. It's not something that is easily done. We are putting aircraft carriers on the water with technology from a decade ago because it takes so long to build and procure these things and the like. And at the same time, Ukraine is teaching us, is it worthwhile to even have a giant stockpile of drones if 1 month from now that drone technology is going to be superseded by a superior drone technology? So are we, in your view, are we moving in the right direction of being nimble enough to adjust to all of this, particularly in an era where things are made more complex with non-state actors, both from terror organizations to multinational corporations that have control over critical technologies, that we're going to be able to navigate this well?
Ukraine and Iran are both regional powers, so their solutions are regional and local. And so therefore they can adopt a drone intensive method of warfare. The United States should not neglect that. We should master it. Power, we maneuver forces globally, and those are different platforms that do that. So the short answer is we need to be able to do both. But nonetheless, I recognize the validity of your point. And the last point I would just make is I once wrote a book about the inversion of the Melian dialogue. And I posited that the weak do as they will and the strong suffer as they must. And that derives because there's an asymmetry of interest. This is an existential issue for Iran. This is not an existential issue for the United States. And sometimes when you get into that space where existential interests collide with non-existential interests, then you have the opportunity for asymmetric forms of warfare that can sometimes be very effective. We need to know that. We need to guard against it because, again, we have global interests. We look at the world as on the surface of the globe. Nations like Iran, Ukraine, and to some degree many other nations don't have the requirement to do that. They can be far narrower in their concerns. But our concerns not only must adapt to the region, they have to adapt to the globe and recognize as the United States imposes conditions in one region, other regions are going to look at how that is done and draw conclusions from it. So our task is far more difficult. Asymmetrically, it's far more difficult than either of those two nations have as they grapple with their problems. And we just need to bear that in mind as we look at these issues.
Well, General, thank you. I think our audience listening to this will be reassured that the professionalism and capabilities of the United States military remain very, very much intact. And so at the end of the day, the outcome of this conflict is going to be dependent on political will and the soundness and competence of the strategic decision making at that level, because U.S. military will be able to execute on those orders. So with that in mind, we will clearly be covering this going forward as events warrant. But General, I know you're on the road. I want to thank you very much for joining us today and for giving us your insights. And Emily, as ever, appreciate all of your inputs here as well. So thank you both. Thank everybody else for joining us. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.